I can't. I can't do this. Jungkook whispered, his voice breaking as he tore his wrist free from Tae's grip, stepping back into the shadows. And with that, Jungkook turned and walked away, his heart shattering with every step he took. Jungkook had been doing everything in his power to avoid Jimin and Tae after that night on the balcony. He couldn't face them, couldn't risk being exposed. He couldn't even bear the thought of sitting in the same room as them, watching Jimin's innocent happiness while his own heart was being ripped apart piece by piece. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't hide forever. The tension had been building for weeks, long, excruciating days where Jungkook barely spoke to anyone, especially Jimin. Every time Jimin invited him over, Jungkook made up an excuse, pulling away from his best friend in a way that hadn't gone unnoticed. "Are you avoiding me?" Jimin had asked him a few days ago, his voice a mix of concern and confusion. "I've just been busy," Jungkook had replied, but even to him, the excuse sounded hollow. Jungkook thought he was handling everything quietly, burying his feelings deep enough so no one would notice. But Jimin wasn't a fool. No matter how much Jungkook wanted to pretend everything was fine, cracks were beginning to show. It was a Saturday evening when it all came crashing down. Jungkook had finally caved and agreed to meet Jimin at their favorite cafe, neutral ground where he hoped the tension wouldn't feel as suffocating. He hadn't expected Tae to be there too, but when he arrived, Tae was already seated beside Jimin, looking as composed and perfect as ever. The sight of them together, so effortlessly in sync, made Jungkook's chest tighten painfully. "Hey Jungkook," Jimin greeted, his bright smile faltering slightly when he saw how tense Jungkook was. Jungkook forced a weak smile and sat down across from them, trying to ignore the weight of Tae's gaze on him. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words, and Jimin, usually the life of any conversation, seemed oddly quiet too. As the evening wore on, the silence between them grew heavier, until finally, Jimin set down his coffee cup with a soft clink, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Jungkook. "Okay, now tell me. What's going on? You've been acting weird for weeks, Kook. And I know it's not just because you're busy. So don't try to fool me," Jimin asked, his voice calm but insistent. His eyes flickered between Jungkook and Tae, sensing the tension but not yet understanding it. Jungkook swallowed hard, his throat dry as panic surged through him. He hadn't expected Jimin to bring it up so directly, and now he felt trapped, caught between the truth and the devastating consequences it would bring. "I'm fine. It's nothing," Jungkook lied, his voice unsteady. But Jimin didn't buy it. His eyes softened, but they held a determination that Jungkook knew all too well. Jimin wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. "No, you're not fine. And I think I deserve to know why my best friend is pulling away from me." "What happened, Kook?" Jimin said quietly, his voice thick with concern. Jungkook's heart pounded in his chest, the walls closing in on him as Jimin's question lingered in the air. He could feel Tae's gaze on him, heavy and unreadable, but it was Jimin's expectant stare that made his blood run cold. "Please don't ask this. I can't tell you," Jungkook whispered, his voice barely audible as he lowered his eyes to the table, hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. Jimin's eyes flickered with something close to hurt. Why not? You're my best friend, Jungkook. We've been through everything together. We are always like brothers. What could possibly be so bad that you can't even talk to me? Jungkook bit his lip, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. He wanted to tell Jimin everything, to confess the painful truth and finally be free of the burden he'd been carrying for so long. But how could he do that? How could he destroy the happiness of the one person who meant the most to him? Actually, Jungkook's voice cracked, and for a moment, he thought he might actually tell Jimin the truth. But before he could, Tae's voice broke through the tense silence. Jimin, stop, Tae said quietly, his deep voice calm but firm. Jimin turned to Tae, confused. What? But why? Tae met Jungkook's eyes across the table, and in that moment, Jungkook knew Tae understood. He had seen it all along, the pain, the longing, the silent love that Jungkook had kept hidden for so long. And now, Tae was about to do the one thing Jungkook could never bring himself to do. Jimin, I think you should know. There's something Jungkook's been holding back. Something that's been hurting him for a long time. Tae said, his voice steady but with a hint of sadness. Jungkook's breath hitched, his eyes widening in shock as Tae spoke. Tae, please, don't. Jungkook started, his voice frantic, but Tae shook his head, silencing him with a look. Jimin frowned, his confusion deepening as he looked between them. What are you talking about? Tae took a deep breath, his eyes softening as he turned to face Jimin fully. Jungkook's feelings for me. The words hung in the air like a bomb, and for a moment, everything went still. Jimin's eyes widened in shock, his face paling as he tried to process what Tae had just said. What? Jimin whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he couldn't believe what he had heard. Jungkook felt his world crashing down around him, his heart pounding in his ears as panic consumed him. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He had never wanted Jimin to find out like this. Jimin, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't. Jungkook choked out, his voice breaking as tears welled up in his eyes. But Jimin wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were fixed on Tae, hurt and confusion swirling in them as he tried to make sense of the situation. And you knew all this time? Jimin asked Tae, his voice trembling. Tae nodded slowly, his expression filled with regret. I figured it out recently. I didn't want to hurt you, Jimin. I never meant for any of this to happen. Jimin looked away, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. Why didn't either of you say anything? Because it would have destroyed everything. I didn't want to come between you two. I couldn't. I couldn't ruin your happiness, Jimin. Jungkook said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jimin's shoulders sagged as he let out a shaky breath, his heart clearly aching. Jungkook, why didn't you tell me? We could have figured this out together. Jungkook swallowed hard, the weight of the truth crushing him. Because I love you too much to take away your happiness. I couldn't bear to be the reason you lost Tae. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unresolved emotions. Finally, Jimin lifted his head, his eyes filled with unshed tears. but there was a new resolve in them. He turned to Tae, his voice steady despite the pain. I think it's best if we end this. Tae's eyes widened. Jimin, you. Before Tae could complete his words, Jimin stopped him by shaking his head, a sad smile tugging at his lips. I can't keep you when I know someone else loves you this much. And I can't stay in a relationship built on half-truths. Tears brimmed in Jungkook's eyes, but Jimin simply stood up, his expression calm, though the heartbreak was evident. He glanced back at Jungkook with a soft, bittersweet smile. You're my best friend, Jungkook. And I love you enough to let this go. Tae was never mine to keep. With that, Jimin turned and walked away, leaving behind the love they had once shared, and the heartache that lingered between them. Jungkook sat frozen in his seat, staring at the door Jimin had just walked through. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of Jimin's words crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Jimin had let go, for his sake. But how could he ever repay that sacrifice? Across the table, Tae was still seated, his eyes fixed on Jungkook with an unreadable expression. The tension between them was thick, filled with all the unsaid words, the stolen glances, and the feelings they had kept buried for so long. Jungkook lowered his head, his hands trembling as he fought the urge to cry. I never wanted this Tae. I never wanted to hurt him. I didn't want things to end up like this. Tae let out a soft sigh, his gaze softening as he reached across the table to gently grasp Jungkook's hand, saying, "To be continued. Last part is coming soon."